I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me returning guest, Dr. Dave Lawie, Chief Geoscientist at Imdex in Australia. Welcome back to the podcast, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's good to be back.
Yes, absolutely. And you and I always have some really good, let's get down into to the meat and potatoes of our industry conversations. And today will be no different. But before we get there, let's give a quick explanation of what Imdex is and what you guys do.
Yes, so Imdex is a mining technology company where head office is in Perth, which is where I am now. But we absolutely operate globally. We're listed on the ASX, we're about $1 billion company. But we're very much involved in sensing and running with drilling programs and developing ore body knowledge and ways to visualize and use that in both from resource development and in mining operations. And increasingly, something that we're interested in is a bit more downstream of all of that, which is mine tailings, which is what we're going to speak about today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation because if you look at the tailings of a lot of mining operations, there are actual value in those tailings if they're able to be handled appropriately and get the minerals out of it. On the balance sheet of the companies, tailings are actually considered a liability because they have to maintain the tailings for environmental reasons. And if a company is likely to have their permit squashed or be told that they're not going to be allowed to operate, it's almost always a factor of how they plan to handle their tailings issues. So this is a good timely conversation. So let's get started. Let's start with for people that don't understand the industry, what tailings actually are.
Yeah, so if we zoom back out to the macro view, the world consumes an incredible amount of resources. And one of the most recent estimates is every year we're now consuming over 100 billion tons of stuff. And a lot of that stuff is made up of, extraction for metals, fossil fuels, and non-metallic components as well as biomass, agriculture, of course, but the majority of it is stuff that we dig up. Now, a way to think about that is all of the stuff that we mine, the rock material, volumetrically, a tiny amount of that, typically, apart from ferrous and coal, is part of the end use, that value chain. The rest of it needs to go somewhere else. So the stuff that goes somewhere else comprises just waste rock, rock that you need to move that doesn't contain ore, it involves tailings, stuff that you process to extract the valuable commodity and the material left over from that, and also things like slag and other junk that you generate along the way. It's the mine tailings and mine waste products are the biggest single waste stream generated in the entire world. So they're just a fact of life at the moment with the current mining technologies. And they're really something that the industry needs to put in their mind to think of novel ways of dealing with. We make it to a point in the future with new, perhaps in situ type mining technologies where we actually minimize the amount of tailings and waste rock, etc., that's developed. But really, for the here and now, that is our life. And also we have an unbelievable, in quotes, legacy of tailings and waste materials that we've developed over the past century, if not longer, which are all sitting around still in the environment and creating liabilities, as you speak about.
Yeah, and as I say, if there's generally an issue with a mine and a mine operation that's looking for a permit to operate, it's generally how they plan to handle the tailings becomes the biggest wrench in the gears of that particular operation to be able to move forward.
Yeah, a lot of the time that's I think we've spoken about this before, with other industries, you can move your assets around, but with mining, our asset is where it is, which means the tailings need to go where the asset is, where the ore deposit is. And sometimes that's just restricted for a multitude of reasons. Some of them are just geographic. There's just no room to put the tailings there. Other times the area is quite environmentally sensitive and people just don't want a big tailings dam. They're not the most attractive things in production, nor do they want giant piles of waste rock. And this of course, particularly afflicts open cut mining, which generates a lot of waste rock as well as tailings. So it's responsible for stranding a lot of assets. And if we want to recast this in the critical minerals discussion as well, also strands a lot of mines which contain valuable commodities and elements that we need.
Yeah, and downstream, it also creates scenarios where accidents can happen. We've seen this in with Vale and tailings dams in Brazil. We saw this with the Imperial Metals tailings dam failure in northern British Columbia. We've seen it again most recently with the dry tailings facility in Turkey that SSR Mining had. When they fail spectacularly, and they create a pretty catastrophic leftover, shall we say, from it all.
Yes, and they're all just horrible occurrences, of course, and they're the things that the general public attaches to mining. And, rightly so, they're true and they have happened. So we most definitely need to do better. On an odd aside to that, when people talk about different biases and they talk about cognitive biases and cognitive dissonance, one of the examples that's used there is they talk to people that live downstream of dams, not tailings dams in this case, but just dams with water. And the people that live furthest downstream worry the most actually about dam failure. Those that live in the middle worry a bit less, but the people who live right under the dam worry the least, just because it's too much to think about, which is the cognitive dissonance. Now that's sort of a bit of a silly story, but it sort of explains a bit why people are so conscious of building these sorts of facilities around mine sites. And of course, with those histories, it doesn't do us any favors at all.
No, it doesn't. So we've talked about the negatives here. Let's start to spin to the positive. All over the world right now, there are lots and lots of tailings facilities, and technology itself is improving to the point where we can clean up these tailings and gain economic asset out of them. And in some cases, some of the critical materials that we're actually looking for that new green economy. So there seems to be a movement and an impetus to clean up old tailings, get critical metals, and clean the environment at the same time. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I can. Now, I've also been talking to some other people myself about this, just because of the level of interest in it. So, I mean, if people want to follow this topic and talk to people who are really working in this area, then there's a few. There's Anita Prabhakar at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at University of Queensland, and then the regeneration guys, so John Thompson, Nicolo Barris, and Stephen Desposito. I've spoken to them a lot, and because from the Anita point of view, she's doing a lot of work now in Australia, especially, but also internationally, characterising the tailings. So if you're going to do something with the tailings, then you need to know what is in the tailings and where it is in the tailings and how it is deported in the tailings. They're all critical things to understand before you can go about any sort of remining or remediation of it in a way that is, ironically, in a way, it's no different to the process you go through before you start a mine. So you need to work out where the various components are and how they're distributed spatially, what they're associated with, and the structure or the technical nature of the material characteristics of where it sits. You need to know all that before you can get to, if you like, to do a pre-feasibility study before you would recover the tailings. I like the way that the regeneration guys talk about tailings, because they really split it into three different types of opportunities. So there's remining. So when most people think about the tailings, and indeed the Australian government working with Anita thinks about it this way as well, is what is in them, what can be recovered directly that's economically attractive or available or viable. especially older tailings, because older mines, the metallurgical processes weren't as efficient, so the recoveries may have been, depending on commodity, of course, in the 60 or 70% range, which means that the rest of the commodity that the mine was put in place for was actually sitting in the tailings and probably near the bottom of the tailings accumulation, assuming the metallurgy has improved over time. But really, that's only one aspect of working with tailings, and it would not apply to all tailings either. So the regeneration guys think about this a bit more expansive as well. So apart from remining the tailings, so extracting those components, there is the restoration element. So there's environmental credits for remediating the tailings, and then there's repurposing tailings, which I think is really particularly interesting, and has been a little bit in the news about this as well. So I think Vale has been looking at using sands, very clean sands in tailings to repurpose that into building materials. It's actually no joke now that people are talking about selling sand to the Arabs. Well, a bit of an aside, with climate change driving hardening of infrastructure, the requirement for materials, building materials, infrastructure materials, is going to go through the roof as well. So that does, I think, open up another opportunity for repurposing tailings. It's a pretty special material. There's a lot of research needs to go on, because after these materials have been through a metallurgical plant and then deposited, there's probably nothing quite like on Earth. And it may be, they may have possibly different structural properties if you heat them up and press them, different thermal properties. They may make insulation if we did something. We just don't really know yet, but they are things which I think we need to explore. The liability aspect is interesting because they can be not just an environmental liability, but they're also a financial liability for the mining companies. And one of the companies that does talk about this publicly in their annual results is actually Rio Tinto, and they put into their balance sheet, which is in the public domain, that they're carrying, I think, $17 billion worth of liabilities attached to tailings, with a bit of a split, maybe 60% iron ore, 40% copper tailings, so they're spread around the world. And they are a seed funder of regeneration. So obviously they're interested in, yes, can you reprocess tailings to extract an economic component of it? But really, if you properly carry the liability on your balance sheet, then it creates a business opportunity. If you can repurpose and restore the tailings, take that off your balance sheet. So it's a different way of looking at the business, because it has a value, and it's almost like a double negative, if you like. So if you have to do extra work to repurpose the tailings, so two negatives, in this case, making a positive, because then you can take it off your balance sheet. So there's a business case to be made for it.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And as you mentioned, especially with older mines, there's still ore tied up in those tailings. So it's possible for us to use some of that ore to help solve the gap in the critical metals that we've been talking about in the last several podcasts that you and I have been doing together.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the targets. One of the prime drivers with the Geoscience Australia, and I think the Queensland State Survey, RMIT and UQ, one of the key things we've been looking at is cobalt in tailings, because that's often, the geos listening to this, and cobalt's often tied up in pyrite, which is sometimes not part of what you're trying to extract. So it goes through the tailings, and there's a lot of cobalt left over in the pyrite that's in the tailings. You don't need to blast the rock or move it particularly far. It's already in a fine-grained state, so relatively easy to leach and dissolve. So people are wondering if there are, cobalt resources sitting in these materials which are actually economic to extract, which would be terrific, because it sort of takes care of the restoration and repurposing side of things as well. It becomes generally self-paid for, especially with these older ones, which I'll say this in air quotes that people can't see. Who owns some of these old tailings facilities? Even in a place like Germany and France, there are thousands of these things, and people talk about 50,000 facilities around the world. I actually think that probably undercalls it.
I wouldn't disagree. It's actually funny that you were to mention about the cobalt. I'm privy to know, and I can never pronounce your last name, so I'm going to apologize for butchering it on the podcast. But I know Nadia Mykytczuk very well. She is the primary scientist for a company called Mirarco Mining Innovation, which is a STEM out of the University of Sudbury in our nickel belt. And she is working with a Bio Leeching partner called Backtech, also an Ontario company. And they're doing exactly what you're talking about with the pyrrhotite tailings from nickel operations. For those who don't know, the Sudbury nickel belt is probably one of the largest nickel belts in the world. And Vale has a $2 billion liability sitting in pyrrhotite tailings. Pyrrhotite itself has a chemical reaction with air that basically causes it to combust. So when they deal with the tailings, they put it underwater to prevent the combustion of it. And if you've ever been up in the Sudbury area, it makes the whole area kind of look like a massive moonscape. And they're finding that in their remediation through the bioleaching process, they're getting nickel, iron, cobalt, sulfur for fertilizer, and then they're able to have a silica product that they can turn into paste that they can take back in and fill in the fissures in the underground mining operations to help remediate that. So it's pretty remarkable what newer technologies are making possible.
Yeah, and I think pyrrhotite is indeed nasty stuff. And I think, in talking to the regeneration guys about this as well, it's it's this circular economy. You can't, when we're doing an NPV calculation about whether or not to develop a mine, it's all done a particular way, but it typically does not involve the full scope right through to closure. And even mine closure is perhaps a limiting thing to talk about. If it was a completely circular economic argument, then the mine plan, if it was possible, would involve reprocessing and removing the tailings post mine closure, or even during mining operation. Now that's a big, I'll admit, that's a big ask to have the mining industry thinking about that. But perhaps the mining industry needs an adjacent industry which has fundamentally different drivers, which value things differently and can separately make an economic case for going about this work, be it older, now abandoned tailings or current tailings, because they have a different remit. They have different shareholders, different drivers. I'm not going to say they'd be a not-for-profit, probably a long way from that, but just a different way of thinking about their business. I think that could be a key unlock to getting a completely circular economy working in our own industry now.
Yeah, and you're talking about existing tailings. So let's go to the dream world where we use technology and there are no tailings at a mine anymore, period. Is that on the horizon, or is that even possible? Or am I, having a fever dream?
No, I don't think it's a fever dream. But perhaps it's not that far away from it either. But in situ leaching of materials without mining them per se is a bit of a holy grail, because it really, environmentally, it would solve so many problems. It would also give us access to resources which are stranded currently, as we spoke about earlier, or just strictly, even if they're not stranded due to restrictions around building tailings and waste facilities, just stranded just due to economics. There's just not enough of the right commodity in a small enough volume to make it economic to extract. And whether to use this word or not, but if you look at the technology revolution that happened in the US with fracking, so to release shale and oil from shale resources, completely changed the economics and the availability of oil and natural gas now in the US, to the point where it's the biggest oil producer in the world, surpassing Saudi. and the biggest LNG exporter. Now, that was all down to a technology which was developed 10 years ago, but then put into production quick smart after that. If there was a way of cracking and then filling the cracks in hard rock, so you can remember hard rock's harder than soft rock, where we get our fossil fuels from. But in a hard rock environment, if we're able to fracture and allow ingress of lixiviants, be them chemical components or bugs, biological leaching agents, to get into a volume of rock and then be able to extract the components back to the surface without mining per se, then I think, that truly would be wonderful. I know that people are also looking at not just chemical lixiviants and bugs, but also applying potential fields, almost like a battery to make anions and cations move around in the rock and pull them out via anodes and cathodes. But, the industry is working on this. It's happening in the background. A lot of this stuff works at an experimental scale, but trying to get it, and by that I mean literally in tanks in laboratories. And we do it. There is a little bit of this happens in I'll just call it the real world now. So people some of the geos here listening will be well familiar with roll front uranium deposits and in situ leaching of them, which is successful. In fact, Boss Uranium here in South Australia has just restarted a mine doing exactly that. And then in Arizona, there are some in situ leach operations which leach oxide copper, not sulfide, but oxide copper. So, it is possible. Can it work with sulfide materials and at sufficient volumes to make a difference and depth and in hard rock to be seen? So roll front uranium is in soft rock, it's in sediments, poorly consolidated sediments in some case, and oxide copper implies that the rocks are also weathered and so not hard rock and easier to get fluids into them. But, if we could do that, it would certainly solve a whole host of problems. But just one word of warning there when we think about these new methods of mining to extract minerals that we need. If we look at copper, since 1900, our industrial use of copper has doubled every 25 years. There's a compound annual growth rate of about 3%, which is roughly equivalent to doubling every 25 years. So, and that's without decarbonisation and AI centres and batteries, electric cars and turbines and all the rest of it. So we're at about 26 million tonnes, including recycling copper now. So 25 years now, called 2050. So about 50 million tonnes. So, are some of these things going to solve all of that? I don't think so. But I think it'll be a case of we'll need to bring to bear whatever we can in the meantime to add up to the total pool of methods we can use to extract what we need.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's one of those situations where every little bit helps. Like I was having a conversation about nickel mining with a pro mining lobby several months ago, and one of the comments was that we could recycle our way out of the problem. And the reality was there wasn't enough nickel in products that would hit the recycling to even satisfy yesterday's demand, let alone today's demand, let alone tomorrow's demand. But it was part of the solution. Unfortunately, mining, but excuse the pun, there's no silver bullet here to solve all the problems.
No, there is not. And I think with copper, we're already recycling. Well, I think 10% of the current supply, maybe a bit more, is from recycling, but the rate it's growing at, it will never fill that gap. And the other thing is it has a long residence time in the application that's put into. So with industrial uses and housing and wiring, etc., it hangs around in the application it's been put into for 50 or 100 years. So it's handy, but by no means the solution.
No, definitely. And a lot of the copper that is going to be needed is going to be needed for stuff that's we're not even factoring into the equations for demand yet.
Yeah, there'll be another podcast, Mark, talking about that.
Oh, we don't. That's the beauty of podcasting, is we never run out of topics for us to be talking about. There's lots of them.
Recycling of, let's not get too far off the beaten track here, but I think recycling things like solar panels and batteries, again, it will become a loud noise in the next 12 months. Perhaps we can talk about that.
I think it will be. Some of the initial electric vehicle batteries are going to be reaching end of life stage pretty close, and there's a number of wind turbines that are out there that are also reaching end of life stage. Solar panels tend to have a little bit longer life, but I suspect some of the first generation solar panels will also be reaching end of life stage as well. So yeah, these are going to be topics that are going to become front and center pretty quick. And, it's just a matter of, how is it that we deal with it, and can we deal with it in an appropriate manner? So what is the solution for all these tailing ponds that, and tailing sites that are all over the world right now? To remediate, get the minerals out of it, and environmentally restore the area so that it's, safe and somewhat pristine again.
I fundamentally think it's not an engineering problem, it's a business problem. I really think that, and I've gotten these ideas actually from talking to the regeneration guys, that it's a business. I think it should be a business to do all of that sits alongside or very adjacent to the mining industry. It needs a different set of strategies, priorities, light on the hill type goals, things like that. And they're able to think freely and operate differently and remove some of the constraints that exist around the current economics of mining. So, the people who are current shareholders of mining companies aren't shareholders of mining companies to go after, repurposing, restoring and remining tailings facilities. That's not why they're invested in the companies, and that's fair enough. But I really think that it needs an expansive and different type of industry to take this problem on, which, and as I said before, not exactly a not-for-profit, but can attract funding to just go about this work because it is its purpose to do that. And in the process, help the mining industry out by taking these liabilities off their balance sheets. So, there's a few strands of genuine value to come out of that. There is the remining of materials which are potentially valuable, but I think ultimately the restoration, repurposing and removing the liabilities off balance sheets are where the value will be. And that really just takes a different business mindset and a different set of investors. I really think that's where it should end up.
Yeah, well, there is that green investor that, won't invest in mining. They won't invest in resources. Perhaps this is an area that they would invest in because it would clean up those problems that they have with those two industries.
Yeah, I mean, it really does tick a whole lot of boxes, and in a way, it allows people who they don't really like the mining industry. I'm using air quotes again, to participate in it and do good, and at the same time allow the industry to supply the materials that the world needs. There's just no getting around the fact that with resource usage of all types, and I call them all critical, really. I don't make much of a subset out of them. Critical minerals is often a political definition anyway. But everything that the world needs is a graph that goes up and to the right. So the problem is not going away. We're still in a position where, and just some data from Robbie Rowe at Sensor slide he gave me, where the percentage of the global population still has no access to electricity as a quarter. Clean water is also a quarter. Sanitation's almost half. So there's no way that resource usage is not up and to the right, which means we will be extracting things and we will be generating waste streams. So if there can be an adjacent industry which is economically invested in dealing with waste streams and fixing old waste streams, which are now piles of stuff, then that allows both to foster and then supply what the planet needs. I haven't actually quite thought about it that way until we've had this chat, actually, Mike. But it seems to now that it's come out of my mouth, it sounds like a good thing to do.
It sounds good to me as well. So if people want to follow your work and the work that Imdex is doing, how do they do so?
So they can have a look for us on our website, but always say people can find me on LinkedIn. Just send me a message and I'm well open to having a conversation. There's these podcasts as well that people can go back to and listen to. I think, Mike, if they listened to them, there would be sort of a theme linking them together. Might be a bit rough, but I'm sure there is one. And there are some other events and things that I speak at as well, if people are interested in these topics. I'm certainly interested in feedback, and particularly this topic. And as I was talking to Mike about before, both of us will be at the SME event in New York in a couple of weeks. So if people are there, very, very happy to talk about these topics at that event.
Yeah, in fact, I was about to mention that myself, that you and I were going to see each other in New York on the 20th through the 22nd of May. The SME's New York chapter, they put on a really good event. It's us in our industry trying to solve problems like you and I were talking about here today about the tailings, amongst other issues. So if you find yourself in New York at that time, probably a good time to register and take in the 2 or 3 days worth of events. And I come away from that event every year with just a raft of new knowledge and a raft of new potential guests, such as Dr. Lawie. So highly recommend it.
To New York, Mike.
Absolutely. So in 2 weeks' time, I'll see you in New York, and safe journey to this side of the water. And I look forward to it.
Thanks, Mike, and see you on the other side.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.